So with the second season of Andor right around the corner, we've been talking a lot about the Rebel Alliance, and that trend will continue today when we focus on the government and organization structure of the Rebel Alliance, mostly from a political standpoint. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. Now, before we really dive into this, I want to sort of talk about where in the Rebel Alliance's timeline we're talking, because the Rebel Alliance changes a lot from the early days to the later days. So, a few distinctions. We are not discussing the New Republic, which came after the Rebel Alliance. It was sort of the successor to the Rebel Alliance. And we're also really not going to be talking about things before the Gorman Massacre, when the Rebel Alliance really unified into a single faction. Before the Gorman Massacre, it was a bunch of small, individual elements operating on their own with some loose oversight, but after the Gorman Massacre and the formal founding of the Rebel Alliance, it became a much more organized fashion, so we're going to really talk about its command structure within that time period from the Gorman Massacre to the founding of the New Republic. One more thing, I've mentioned command structure, I really mean more like governmental structure, so how the government of the Rebel Alliance worked, and it did have a government. That's one of the weird things, is unlike most other rebel movements, both in real life and in fiction, the Rebel Alliance seems very organized, especially when they start to really form into one faction. They become a functional government in a lot of ways, with a lot of institutions you'd expect to see from a functional government, so let's just sort of dive right in. So the civilian government section of the Rebel Alliance is called the Alliance Civil Government, and it is completely separate from their military chain of command, but does give orders to that military, acting as a sort of executive branch within the Alliance to restore the Republic. At the top of the Alliance Civil Government is the Alliance Cabinet, this group of 6 high-ranking rebel officials. These are the leaders of the Rebel Alliance. We see them meeting, for example, before the Battle of Scarif, and usually these meetings are much more open, with basically anyone in the vicinity able to pitch in and give their ideas. It is led by the Alliance Chief of State, who, through most of the Alliance's history, was Mon Mothma. This is the closest thing the Rebel Alliance has to a definitive leader, their head of state, if you will. This cabinet would make all of the crucial decisions for the day-to-day operations of the Rebel Alliance, and even in a military sense, in their war against the Galactic Empire. And as the Alliance actually started to gain territory, this organization was also responsible for creating and then enforcing laws, which is a little bit odd, but is understandable for a faction that's still trying to get its footing. All of this would be changed to a much wider government when the New Republic came to power, so this is more or less a stand-in as the Rebel Alliance sort of gains steam. This cabinet consisted of a number of ministers, as well as the Chief of State. First among them would be the Minister of Education, who understandably handles education within Rebel Alliance-controlled territories. Secondly would be the Minister of Finance, who's responsible for managing the financial ends of the Rebel Alliance. This would include funding their ongoing war and procuring funds through things like the raid on Aldhani, which, while wasn't specifically propping up the formal Rebel Alliance, I'm sure they would carry out similar raids later on with similar effects, so they were working in close conjunction with some of the methods the Rebel Alliance could use to acquire funds. The Minister of Industry was in charge of managing the industrial output of the Rebel Alliance, something that is crucial for a state at war, but also crucial for the peacetime and home front efforts for the Rebel Alliance. The Minister of State would manage diplomatic relations between the Rebel Alliance and factions around the galaxy. Think of this like a Secretary of State for the United States. It plays a similar role. An interesting one was the Minister of Supply, particularly important when a nation is at war. They would manage the logistics side of keeping the Rebel Alliance in the fight, which was particularly difficult, seeing the Rebel Alliance's asymmetric military situation. Which brings you to the last minister, the Minister of War, which should be pretty self-explanatory. They're the ones in charge of sort of representing the Alliance military within this council. Beyond this council, there was several diplomatic corps that would mostly focus on holding envoys with other planetary governments, often planetary governments that quietly or secretly supported the Rebel Alliance, as it was far too politically and honestly militarily risky for a planetary government to come out in the open and say they support the Rebel Alliance. As such, these diplomatic corps were often, these officers from these diplomatic corps, often focused on blending in with the local population and doing clandestine meetings as opposed to open formal meetings. And while all of this is a civilian government, more or less, that gave credence to the Rebel Alliance as a civilian political entity, it all served to propel the Rebel Alliance forward in their war against the Galactic Empire, a war that really... I mean, it kicked off basically when the Galactic Empire came to power, but it really accelerated, and the Rebel Alliance really sort of formed one faction after the Gorman Massacre. Now, we're probably going to learn more about the Gorman Massacre in a few weeks when Andor Season 2 arrives, but if you'd like to learn more about what we know right now about the Gorman Massacre, I'll leave a link up here to a video I have on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think this is an efficient civilian government for a non-state actor that is engaged in a civil war. Do you think this is too organized or not organized enough? Do you think it makes sense to have all of this power sort of laid at the feet of a single council of 6 people? Or do you think this power should be dissipated among a larger group, seeing that, once again, this is not a state actor, but a non-state actor that is operating independently of any actual political control? And if you have anything else you'd like to see covered in Star Wars or anywhere else in science fiction, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.